My name is Paul Wolf. I serve as president of the New York Coalition for Open Government. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that advocates for transparency in government. And we have members from all across the state. We are all volunteers, no paid staff, just a passionate group of folks. And today our topic is executive sessions. So I get a lot of emails, probably more emails about executive sessions than any other issue. We have done several reports on executive sessions where we have highlighted over and over many public bodies just doing it wrong. So today, whether you're a government official or reporter or just a concerned citizen, you'll learn the basics of what's required to do an executive session properly. And we'll talk about some big loopholes that exist in the law as well that are a problem. So I'm going to just go over a few PowerPoint slides that I can share. So let me see if I could share my screen here. Here we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. I don't know.
It's still loading.
Oh, okay.
There you are.
All right. So, as I said, that's the name of our organization. My name, serving as president. Nonprofit, nonpartisan. I encourage you to check out our website, which is nyopengov.org. We have a great new website, thanks to Axel, our board member, who created that for us. And there's tons of information on there, and I encourage you to check it out. So let's talk about who the open meetings law applies to. It applies to public bodies. And I will also send an email out of these slides to everyone who registered for this. So basically, open meetings law applies to any entity for which a quorum is required to conduct public business that consists of two or more members. So basically, your village board, town board, city council, county legislature, planning board, zoning board, industrial development agency, all those types of bodies are subject to the open meetings law. And then it also applies to some committees and subcommittees, but we're not going to get into the weeds on that. We may. And after I go through these slides, I think the more interesting part of this is taking your questions, which is always really the best way to talk about this. But generally speaking, advisory committees or bodies are not subject to the open meetings law. And that's a big bone of contention as well. So a lot of committees that a town board will form that consist of citizens and not, only the elected officials, those are typically an advisory body and typically not subject to the open meetings law. You can operate an advisory body under the open meetings law, but you're not required to. So we always encourage government officials that any committee you form, whether advisory or not, you should comply with the open meetings law. But just be aware that advisory bodies are not required to do so. So under the Public Officers Law, Section 105, and I did email everyone who registered for this session a copy of the law, just so you would have it. There are 8 reasons when an executive session is allowed. And they're listed here. We'll go through basically anytime where public safety could be an issue. So, if you're talking about bomb threats, terrorist threats, school shooting, that could be something that's subject to an executive session. Any matter which may disclose the identity of a law enforcement agent or informer. That's pretty rare, but that could be a reason for an executive session. Anything relating to a current future investigation or prosecution of a criminal offense, which would, affect law enforcement if disclosed. That also is pretty rare. Discussions regarding proposed pending or current litigation. That happens a lot, and we'll talk about some of the problems that come with that. Collective negotiations, meaning collective bargaining negotiations, union negotiations, that can be a reason for an executive session. And there's a few more. When you're discussing the medical, financial, credit, or employment history of a particular person, there's a lot in this section here. Anytime you're discussing disciplining someone, hiring someone, suspending someone, that can be a reason for an executive session. A G is kind of a weird one. I don't know where this comes from, but the preparation, grading, or administration of exams. I've never seen that as an issue. H comes up sometimes when a public body is talking about acquiring, selling, or leasing real property. But there's a big, but here, but only when publicity would substantially affect the value. So if it's well known that the town is planning to sell a property, there's no reason to do that in executive session. Or if it's well known the town is buying or leasing something, it's only if it became public and it would substantially affect the value, and that can be something difficult to determine, that an executive session is appropriate. So those are the 8 reasons. If someone's going into an executive session and it doesn't fall into one of these 8 categories, then there's an issue or a problem. We've seen sometimes where there'll be no reason given for an executive session, just a motion to go into executive session. And that is certainly improper. So let's talk about some of the issues here. An executive session should not be scheduled in advance. We see this happen sometimes. You shouldn't see a meeting notice that comes out, we're meeting Friday at 10 a.m. and the only agenda item is an executive session. I mean, that really raises the question of, well, when was there a discussion about this being an executive session? When did that occur? They're not supposed to schedule an executive session in advance. I see it happen. It should be just part of a regular meeting. And I think it's also a good practice to do an executive session at the end of a meeting, not in the beginning or the middle of a meeting, because it really does inconvenience people that show up that, suddenly you now have to go sit out of the room, which could be for a half hour to 2 hours. I think it's better practice. Go through your regular meeting agenda. And then if there's going to be executive session, kind of do that as a last item of business. The motion for an executive session has to occur in public. So again, there should be a public meeting, a public notice. Someone makes the motion. You have to state one of those 8 reasons, and you have to be specific. As you recall, in the statute itself, one of the reasons for an executive session is pending or proposed litigation. Well, so we'll see people make a motion to discuss pending litigation. Well, because that's what the statute says. But we also have to keep in mind that in addition to the statute, there's been court decisions, there's been opinions that have gone beyond the statute. And there are court decisions that say simply discussing litigation or pending litigation is insufficient. If you're going to do an executive session to discuss a legal matter, you have to state the name of the case. So it should be, Wolf versus the village of Kenmore. The public has a right to know what legal matter are you discussing. It shouldn't just be to discuss litigation. And you should only be doing an executive session in any event to discuss a legal matter if you're discussing legal strategy. If you're just getting an update from your attorney, the town attorney, as to the status of a lawsuit, that should be done in public. There's no reason why the public can't hear the next court date is and what it's scheduled for. That doesn't need to be done in secret or private. It should only be if you're discussing, some legal strategy of how you're planning to handle this case that the other side shouldn't hear. And quite honestly, board members shouldn't be involved in legal strategy. Leave that to the attorneys. Another issue comes up. You'll see an executive session motion to discuss a personnel matter. Not specific enough. It's interesting when you look through the open meetings law regarding executive session, there is no mention of the word personnel. It's never mentioned in the open meetings law. It does state that you can have an executive session to discuss the employment history of a person, to discuss hiring someone, firing someone, disciplining someone. So you should state that in your motion, going into executive session to discuss hiring someone or disciplining someone. You don't have to state the person's name, but give the public some idea as to what the reason is for the executive session. Personnel is too vague. There's been court decisions regarding that. And I also did send out in my email earlier today a couple of opinions by the Committee on Open Government that discusses some of these things and how to make a proper motion. Simply stating to discuss collective bargaining negotiations is insufficient. You should state the name of the union. We're going to go into motion to go in executive session to discuss collective bargaining negotiations with, Union 232 of the janitors union, whatever. You got to be more specific than just these general vague headings. This is one of my favorite. You'll see this often. If you recall, when we were looking at the statute, the law, it gave one of the items, one of the reasons you could do an executive session, and it stated this. And I'll see this a lot of times at a meeting, and holy cow, I think I counted this one time. There's like 17 different reasons stated there. You got to pick one. You can't, one or two. You can't just verbatim repeat this section of the law. And there's been court cases that have said that. A lot of town attorneys think, well, this is appropriate. I'm just reiterating what the law says. Well, there's court decisions that say it's not appropriate. This is too many different things. I, as a member of the public, have no idea what this executive session is about. So you need to be more specific. If you do have an executive session, people are sometimes surprised to learn you can vote on items in an executive session. So if you're taking a vote whether someone should be disciplined or not, that can occur in executive session. It has to be documented in your meeting minutes. You could still leave out the person's name because, again, it's not required to be disclosed. But one thing you can't do in an executive session is vote to spend public money. And I think I've seen this recently. There was like a school superintendent where they had a meeting and an executive session. They voted to, can't remember if it was, extend the contract or give the person a raise. You can't do that in executive session. You have to do that in a public vote. If there is an executive session and some voting occurs, there should be minutes of that executive session. As people may know, the minutes don't have to be incredibly detailed, but it does need to document motions that are made and votes that occur. But you can also, again, redact things in your executive session minutes or not include certain things that you don't have to disclose, people's HIPAA or medical situations. attorney-client privilege communications don't need to be disclosed. So there are things that can still be withheld. If you do voting in an executive session, meeting minutes, you have to post that within 1 week online. For regular meetings without an executive session, it's 2 weeks. So there's a quicker turnaround for posting executive session minutes. And there is no requirement that minutes have to be approved. So some places have said, well, we can't post minutes until the next board meeting. That's not true. You don't have to approve minutes, but if that's your practice, you can still post draft minutes, stamp them as draft, but you have to get them up within a week's time. There are two big loopholes in the law that drive me crazy, and you should be aware of. One is the political party caucus meetings. Members of the same political party are allowed under the law to meet in private. So if your town board is, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, the 3 Republicans can have a private meeting of just the Republicans only. The 2 Democrats can also have a private meeting of just the Democrats only. There does not have to be any public notice of that meeting, no meeting minutes. They can have staff members come into that meeting, so long as another member of another party that's an elected official does not participate. This to me is an unbelievable loophole in the law. So basically, whatever party is in control can literally run through the meeting agenda in private, and it happens in some places. They can discuss public business and party business in a caucus meeting, and they can go through the whole meeting agenda, bring in department heads, kind of, have everything decided, and then the public meeting is kind of just a show. No discussion, no debate. Everything's just kind of approved. The one caveat to that is if a board is all of one party, if it's 5 Republicans or 5 Democrats, you cannot have a private caucus meeting. There are court decisions stating courts have said, now that's going too far. Now if there's no minority members, you don't need to have a political party caucus where you discuss public business, and that's not allowed. How you police these things is very difficult. Another big loophole. Now, it's not true in other states as well that there's these caucus meetings. That's something that we as a coalition would like to eliminate. Another big kind of loophole is getting legal advice. And government officials, town board members, city council members, county legislators are allowed to get legal advice. And that doesn't have to be done through an executive session. It's actually an exemption under the open meetings law that board members can meet with their attorney at any time without a public meeting, without notice. Fortunately, many places will still make an executive session motion to get legal advice from our attorney. But something to be aware of is they don't have to. They could have a private meeting without any notice with their attorney. Now, that's supposed to be limited to just getting legal advice about a particular situation. It shouldn't veer off into any other discussions. Again, very hard to police. So bottom line is executive session should be rare and held for the right reasons. Just because you can have an executive session, you don't have to. All 8 of those things that are listed in the law, you could talk about them in public. You don't have to have an executive session. And I frequently try to make that clear to board members. You can discuss legal issues in public. You can discuss union negotiations in public. There's nothing saying you can't, but you have the ability under the law to have a private meeting. I think these executive sessions happen more often than they should. I see in some places, literally every meeting has an executive session. I used to live in the town of Tonawanda, and one time I did a check, and fortunately their meeting minutes documented when their executive session started and when it ended. And I was able to show that they actually met more in private than they did in public. It was amazing. They would have, 2-hour executive sessions and a, half-hour public meeting. That's just not the way government should work. So we're here to help. Check out our website, follow us on Facebook. I think you all have my email address, and there's my phone number. We're here to help answer questions, whether you're a reporter, a member of the public, or a government official, wondering whether you're doing something correctly or not. So I think what happens a lot is there's just a lot of bad habits that someone gets on a board and the executive session motion is made to discuss litigation. And that's just the way it's always been done. No one's ever told them otherwise. So people just fall in with the way things are always done. And they're often surprised to be informed that they're doing it wrong. And unfortunately, a lot of government attorneys are not up to speed on things as well. A lot of government attorneys, in addition to their government work, they have their own law practice. And they may not have had any experience with the open meetings law or FOIL law. They're politically connected. They know the right people. They do real estate closings. They do divorce. They've never handled an open meetings law or a FOIL law case in their life. And now they're the, town attorney. So we see a lot of instances of just bad legal advice and, government officials saying, look, I just followed what the attorney told us to do. And that just happens far too often as well. So that's the slides I wanted to go through. I'm happy to answer any questions people may have, perhaps raise your hand and then go from there. Mary Lou.
What would you suggest is a good way to address a improperly called executive session if you're in that city council meeting or that board meeting?
That's a good question. I know some reporters or members of the public will, literally stand up and when they hear a motion that's incorrect, saying, you can't do it that way. That's not proper. Now, you don't want to be disruptive, but sometimes it's the only way to, otherwise you point it out after the fact, which, you can do that as well. After the fact, you email the town officials and say, look, my understanding of the law is that was not a proper executive session motion, and hopefully educate people to do it correct the next time. But I have seen reporters and members of the public just stand up right at the moment the motion is made. Now, you may be told to sit down and shut up because you're disrupting the meeting. But so either way, one way or the other, we need to educate people that they're just not doing it correctly.
Thank you.
And there's great opinions, those opinions that I emailed to you, you can certainly forward to town officials, because a lot of times they'll say, well, who the hell are you? What do you know? Well, here's some opinions by the Committee on Open Government, which actually references court cases. You should take a look at it. Anyone else? Axel.
So what happens to decisions that are made or votes that are taken in executive session where it is an improper use? We had an interesting case in our beautiful hometown of Mount Vernon here, where on the library board, they wanted to vote out the president, but they didn't want to do it in public. Right, so they made a motion, but didn't get a second, and then kind of died. Then somebody said, why don't we just go into an executive session? They went into executive session, and then in executive session, basically suddenly had a second, right, and voted him out. But that is obviously something that should be taking place in public, right? So
Correct.
whatever happens to that action, is that something you can challenge? What is the result?
That's a good question. Under the law, your only recourse really is to file a lawsuit. In Article 78, which is the section of the law, you have 4 months from the time an improper vote occurs. But the court has leeway to say, yeah, you're right. So you could ask the court to void whatever action was taken, overturn that action. They would have to redo it. But there are court decisions as well that say, well, long as they thought they had a reasonable basis for doing an executive session, it wasn't intentional, the court will sometimes let it go. It's very frustrating. So to really overturn it, you got to spend time and money with an attorney. Now, the other thing you can do is, at least get the news media's attention. And sometimes, a story on the news or in the newspaper will prompt people to think twice and redo things the correct way. So media attention, we should never overlook. I mean, that's certainly quicker and cheaper than spending money on an attorney, and sometimes more effective. Michelle.
Yes, I'm going to read a question from the chat. It says, if one is the subject of the executive session, does that person have a right to hear what goes on?
Well, if you're a board, I assume if you're a board member and they're talking about, something regarding you, I think as a board member, you always have a right to be present. There may be circumstances, I'm not sure. I guess I would need more details regarding the question. I would say in general, if you are a member of that board, you have a right to attend. Certainly if you're an employee or something and they're talking about disciplining you, you don't have a right to be in the executive session. A public body can invite whoever they deem to be appropriate into an executive session. So they can bring department heads in, the attorney, other people. It's up to them who they invite in. But if you're an elected member, I would think you have a right to be there. But that could be different depending on whether you're the one being disciplined, I suppose. Anne Marie.
So my question falls along the same line as the one that was on the chat. I'd like to know if a board going into executive session has to inform the public who they're inviting into the executive session, so that, if they're going in for a collective bargaining agreement, obviously you'd want to know why the fire chief is going in, especially if they're not, if it's not part of the union contract. So does the public get to know who is being asked into the public executive session? Sorry, just executive session.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. My answer off the top of my head is I don't think they have to inform the public, but I would have to look at that. I think it's up to them. I don't think it has to be publicly announced or informed, but I'd have to double check that. Christine.
Hi. When I was on my town council in South Carolina, we could go into executive session, and just as you said, we had to give a very specific reason why. We could have discussion in executive session, but we could not vote or take any action. We had to come back out into the public in order to take action. Is that true here too?
No, they can vote in an executive session here, long as it's not a vote to spend money. But they can take votes in an executive session. And, the public kind of has to wait a week to see the meeting minutes come out sometimes to see what that vote was. It usually doesn't happen. Typically, there'll be a discussion in executive session, and then they'll come out and do a public vote of some sort. But they are allowed to vote in an executive session. It's pretty rare, but it can happen. Anne Marie.
So if they get to vote in executive session, which I'm a former board member, and I know that we could vote in executive session, but doesn't it require that they also have minutes of an executive? Or is there another instance where executive session minutes would be required besides an actual vote in executive?
You have to have minutes if any voting occurs in executive session. I don't think you need minutes otherwise. Minutes only have to record motions and votes. If there was no voting that occurred, generally there's not executive session minutes that I see. I don't think they're required to have them. Anyone else? Michelle?
They are required to post the minutes if there was a vote, but again, it's just as you're saying, if there's a vote, then they have to have minutes and they have to post it, and those have to be posted within a week.
Yep. Anyone else? If not, I'll talk about another interesting part of executive sessions that comes up sometimes. One of them is are members required to keep what occurred in executive session confidential? And this is an interesting one. There is a lot to this. First, you start with the only things required to be confidential are what is required by law. So if there's a statute, there's statutes regarding students. There's a law that says you should not disclose student information. There's a law that says you should not disclose people's medical conditions. There's a law that says you should not disclose attorney-client communications. But unless there's a statute, there is nothing that requires a board member to keep an executive session confidential. Now, a lot of school districts will have policies, and sometimes other public bodies will have a policy that says it's our policy that anything said in executive session should be kept confidential. So you might be violating your board policy, but there's no legal requirement that what occurs in an executive session has to stay confidential. You might annoy your colleagues. There have also been cases of a board member who was no longer a board member disclosing executive sessions. And once you're no longer a board member, there's no requirement that you have to abide by that either. There have been some interesting cases where the Board of Education has removed a board member for disclosing executive session discussions. And I know Robert Freeman, who was the head of the Committee on Open Government at the time, strongly disagreed with that, that he didn't think that was appropriate to remove someone on that basis. But, the New York State Education Department has their own rules and hearings and procedures. So that comes up a lot about confidentiality of executive sessions. Any other questions? Michelle?
Yeah, so say your board or your body goes into improper executive session, and then they come out and they say no decisions were made, but then there's a subsequent vote on what the subject that they just went into executive session was for. What is the public's recourse to try to get that rectified?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you sue, the court is going to say, well, they at least had a public vote. But if you say, yeah, but the executive session discussion was improper, it's hard to address that. I mean, you can try to say the vote was invalid, but I don't know if you would be successful. It's a very hard law to police. Now, in other states, which is interesting, and this is something I would like to see in New York, in other states, they record executive sessions. So someone can say, I think that executive session was improper. And the courts then will review the tape and say, you know what, you're right. So the tape is supposed to be just a record for that purpose, not supposed to be released otherwise. But it's interesting that in other states, they require that. We don't require that in New York, and maybe we should, because policing these things is very difficult. If a board member says that discussion was improper, there's no tape, no transcript. We get into a he said, she said, and it gets very difficult. Anyone else? I know you guys all see executive sessions that drive you crazy, whether you're reporters or a member of the public. Sonia, you got to unmute yourself.
I would say, in response to your comment, Article 70s are expensive. You know what? How about taking a little camera and making a video of what that workshop session or common council is? Have your own little website where you can share things with people. That's a lot cheaper than Article 78s and in the grind of, attending court all the time. So it occurs to me, and yeah, you sacrifice a lot of your time, but expose what's happening. And what I've seen in the past, people were, oh, geez, I didn't know that was happening at a school board or at a meeting. But I'm thinking from what we're hearing, take a little pocket, any device to film what's happening. It's laid out there. That occurs to me from what I'm hearing. Good points and comments, but I'm just thinking, put it right in their face. This is what's going on.
All right. Anne Marie.
I would encourage people to speak up if they're going into executive session and it's improper. The most they're going to say to you is you're out of order, but you at least got to get it out there. And then at your next time, if you have public comment and you can comment, I would bring to them the law and what the law states and ask them how it was proper what they did or legal what they did. And could they please, work on providing more detail to the public and be transparent. But you can sit there silently and kind of kick yourself later because you didn't say something, or you can say something. And I have said it both at school board meetings and at town board meetings. When they put it up as we're going in for personnel, I will speak up and ask, could you please provide more information than just personnel? Or we're going in for a collective bargaining agreement. Well, which one? You have 3. Can you tell us which one it is? So there's nothing wrong with speaking up. Yes, they might say you're out of order, but like I said again, better now than later after they come back out later and vote on something that you wanted to hear. So just my suggestion.
Good advice, good practical approach. Anyone else before we wrap up? I know folks have a 6:30 meeting as well for Open Meetings Committee. Sonia.
Piggybacking not piggybacking, but supporting. When I think back now, how meetings, a lot of people, you would think they would feel they want to participate. But I know today, for a lot of years, people have busy lives and working 2 jobs, what have you. But if people just gave a thought to ask a question or bring up, like Anne Marie said, hey, what you said, why are you doing this or that? Take like as if you're green and just bring up something simple and start that simple tone, and maybe other people seeing resulted because there was not antagonizing, generating, but just, hey, here's a basic question. Why are you doing it that way? Let that grow into something getting even bigger and involve people waking up to, hey, things are happening when people are attending, asking basic questions, keeping it civil, and growing from that. Anne Marie is so right.
I think the biggest issue is education. Like I said, I don't think a lot of it is done purposefully. Sometimes it is done purposely, but I think most of the time they just don't know better. This is the way they've always done it, and no one's ever pointed it out to them that they're doing it wrong. Anne Marie.
Actually, on that note, one of the things I used to use when I used to go to the school board meetings, and even though I was a board member there at one point, when I wanted to address that, I would say, could you please educate me? Because you're a school board. It's a school. Educate me. So little tricks.
Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap it up? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, for those of you, again, there's at 6:30 an open meetings law committee, which has a separate link for people to join. I thank everyone for attending. We'll probably post this recording on our website so we can help educate more people. And I thank you for your great questions. The questions are always the best part. And there's always one or two questions that will now make me go back and take a look, and I learned something from the questions as well. So thank you for taking the time, and we'll be doing more of these. We have more planned for coming up in the new year on open meetings and FOIL issues. So we all learn from each other through these.